The morning was cold and quiet when Clara Reed stepped off the bus. She held a small folder tightly against her chest as she walked toward the tall gray courthouse. Her hands were trembling, not from the chill but from nerves. The building looked huge and intimidating, its marble pillars stretching high like they were guarding something important. People in black suits rushed past her, holding thick files, talking fast on their phones. She felt smaller with every step she took. Her clothes were simple: a pale blue blouse, a long skirt, and old shoes that had lost their shine. She had tied her hair neatly, but a few strands kept falling on her forehead. She brushed them away and whispered to herself, "It will be fine, Clara, just speak clearly." Her voice was soft. Almost unsure inside, the courtroom buzzed with voices. Lawyers laughed together near the front, clerks moved stacks of papers, and the guards looked serious at the doors. Clara found an empty seat in the back row and sat down quietly. She placed her folder on her lap and tried to steady her breathing. The walls smelled of paper and old wood polish. Everything looked formal and cold. She had never been in a courtroom before, at least not like this. The sound of a gavel hit the air, and everyone went silent. The judge entered, a tall man with stern eyes and a heavy robe. Everyone stood. Clara stood too, but her knees felt weak when her case number was called. She froze for a second. "Case 29B, Reed versus Parker," said the clerk loudly. Clara swallowed hard and stood up, clutching her folder. All eyes turned toward her. Her steps were small and careful as she walked to the front. Her shoes clicked softly against the polished floor. She stopped in front of the judge's bench, her heart pounding in her chest. "State your name," the judge said without looking up. "Clara Reed, Your Honor," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Are you representing yourself?" he asked, sounding surprised. "Yes, sir," she said. "I cannot afford a lawyer." The courtroom went silent for a moment. Then a soft laugh came from one of the benches. A young lawyer from the other side, Mr. Parker, smirked. "This should be quick," he muttered loud enough for people to hear. A few others chuckled. Clara felt her cheeks burn, but she said nothing. The judge sighed. "Very well. Proceed." Clara opened her folder, her fingers trembling. The papers were neatly arranged. She had spent weeks preparing them, reading legal books late at night, watching courtroom videos online. She wanted to do everything right. She took a deep breath and started, "Your Honor, I am here because my landlord, Mr. Parker, has been—" Before she could finish, the lawyer on the other side interrupted with a confident tone. "Objection, Your Honor. The lady seems confused about legal procedure." Clara blinked. Startled, the judge frowned slightly. "Sustained, Miss Reed. Please follow proper format." "I'm sorry, sir," she said quickly. "I'm trying my best." The opposing lawyer grinned. "Of course you are," he said sarcastically, loud enough for the room to hear. The people in the back laughed again. Clara's heart sank. Her hands shook harder. She tried to continue. "I only want to explain my situation." The lawyer rolled his eyes. "Your situation is irrelevant without evidence," he said sharply. "This is not a charity, Miss Reed. It's a courtroom." The judge sighed again. "Please, let's move along, Miss Reed. Do you have documents?" Clara nodded quickly and handed her folder to the clerk. Her voice was barely steady as she said, "Yes, I have proof, sir. Rent receipts and letters." The clerk placed them on the table. The judge glanced at them, then handed them back without much care. "We'll review later," he said dismissively. The opposing lawyer smirked again, whispering something to his assistant. The people nearby smiled, amused. To them, she looked like a lost woman trying to fight a battle she didn't understand. Clara stood there quietly, her eyes down, trying to hide the sting in her chest. She had done everything right. Every paper, every word, but no one cared. She could feel the laughter around her. Like small cuts to her confidence, still she didn't break. She took a slow breath and said softly, "Thank you for listening." "Your Honor," the judge nodded slightly. "We'll adjourn for now." "Next case," he said, banging his gavel. The sound echoed through the room like a heavy door closing. Clara turned and walked back to her seat. Each step felt heavier than the last. The people around her whispered again. "She looks so nervous," one said. "She had no idea what she was doing," another added. Clara gathered her things slowly, pressing her folder tightly against her chest. Her eyes stayed dry, but her throat burned. As she walked out of the courtroom, the guards barely looked at her. She passed through the long marble hallway and stepped outside into the sunlight. For a moment, she stood on the courthouse steps, staring at the tall building. People walked past her without noticing. She could still hear the laughter echoing in her mind, but her face stayed calm. She whispered quietly to herself, "One day, they'll remember this moment differently." Then she walked away, her steps small but steady. What no one knew that day, not the judge, not the lawyer, not the people who mocked her, was that Clara Reed wasn't just a simple woman lost in legal papers. She was a woman with fire hidden behind gentleness, a woman who had studied law years ago, and who had once promised herself she'd stand for justice. That day they saw a nervous visitor, but one day soon, they would see a woman who carried authority, not as revenge but as truth. The same court that made her feel small would one day rise when she entered, and those who laughed would sit in silence as she spoke, calm, confident, and unshakable. The woman they once mocked now sitting where judgment truly belonged. The following morning the courthouse was buzzing again. The same lawyers, the same guards, the same arrogant rhythm filled the air. But for Clara Reed, the embarrassment from yesterday still sat heavy in her heart. She replayed every laugh, every smirk, every dismissive glance in her mind. Each one stung, but instead of breaking her, it lit something inside her, a quiet, steady flame. She sat at her small wooden desk at home, the same folder open in front of her. Her hands rested on the papers as she whispered, "They thought I didn't belong there." A faint smile touched her lips. "Let's see about that." While the world went on as usual, Clara began working in silence. She opened her laptop and started reading through legal archives, old case rulings and court procedures. The more she read, the steadier her breath became. Every word reminded her of what she once loved: the law, justice, fairness, the belief that truth, even when quiet, could stand taller than arrogance. That afternoon, she returned to the courthouse, not for her case but to collect more documents. As soon as she stepped inside, she could feel the eyes again. The same clerk from yesterday whispered to a colleague, "There's that woman again." Another one laughed. "Maybe she still thinks she can win." Clara heard it but didn't flinch. She had already learned that silence is the strongest answer. When she reached the counter, the senior clerk barely looked up. "Yes, ma'am, what do you need?" he asked in a bored tone. "I'd like copies of yesterday's hearing notes and access to the case transcripts," she said politely. Her tone was soft but precise. The man blinked, slightly surprised. "Those are for review officers only." Clara nodded calmly. "I understand, but I believe I qualify," she replied. The clerk frowned. "You? Why?" She smiled faintly. "Because I'm preparing for a position that requires understanding of judicial behavior." The man chuckled, thinking she was joking. "You mean like a legal intern?" She looked at him directly, her eyes calm. "No," she said quietly. "Like a judge." The laughter around the counter stopped abruptly. The clerk cleared his throat awkwardly. I see," he said, pretending to type something. "Well, I'll see what I can do." Clara thanked him gently and walked away. Her steps were slow, but her heart was steady. Every word, every smirk she heard that day no longer hurt. They fueled her. They reminded her that her journey wasn't just personal. It was proof that humility often hides power. A few hours later, as she waited for her documents, she sat in the same bench where she had been humiliated the day before. This time her eyes didn't look nervous, they looked focused across the room. The same lawyer who mocked her, Mr. Parker, was speaking loudly to another client. Boasting about his easy victory, he noticed her sitting there and grinned. "Oh, you again? Back for another lesson in law?" he said mockingly. Clara tilted her head slightly and smiled. "Actually, yes," she said softly. "Every day is a lesson, isn't it?" He laughed, thinking she was being naive. "You're funny," he said. "But take my advice, people like you shouldn't waste time trying to play lawyer." She looked straight into his eyes, calm and unshaken. "You're right," she said. "I shouldn't play lawyer. I should play judge." His smile faded. "Judge?" he repeated, his tone mocking but uncertain. Clara nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "Someone has to make sure the next time a lawyer mocks a woman in court, there's someone sitting high enough to stop it, mister." Parker scoffed and turned away, but his smirk didn't last long. Something about her voice, the quiet confidence in it, unsettled him. Later that day, Clara went home and placed her court documents neatly beside her study books. The wall above her desk was filled with sticky notes, laws, case references, Handwritten reminders like patience is power and learn before you lead. Every night after finishing her small tutoring job, she stayed awake reading legal texts. Her small apartment light would stay on until dawn. The neighbors often wondered what she was doing. Some thought she was preparing for another case, but she was preparing for something much greater. Weeks passed and Clara kept visiting the courthouse quietly, sometimes as an observer, sometimes as a volunteer helping people fill their forms. Slowly, the clerks began to notice her. Some grew curious. "Why do you come here every day?" One of them asked. She smiled. "Because this place embarrassed me once," she said softly, "and I'm making sure it never embarrasses anyone like me again." Her calm determination began to earn respect, even from those who once laughed. They didn't know what she was planning, but they could feel that she was different. She carried herself with quiet authority, the kind that couldn't be faked. One morning, as she was helping an old woman fill out legal paperwork, the same lawyer, Mr. Parker, passed by and stopped for a moment. He watched her carefully explaining each line to the woman, her patience unwavering. He looked uneasy, though he didn't understand why. What he didn't know was that the woman sitting there, humble and quiet, had already passed the National Judicial Exam. Her appointment letter as a junior district judge had been finalized. It just hadn't been announced yet. Clara didn't need to tell anyone. Her silence carried the kind of strength that words couldn't match. She knew her time was coming. The same halls that once echoed with laughter at her expense would soon fall silent at her presence. And as she looked around that courtroom once more, the same one that had made her feel small, she smiled faintly and whispered under her breath, "Soon, I'll sit here again, not as the one being judged, but as the one giving justice." The guards, clerks, and lawyers had no idea that their next appointment hearing would be one they would never forget. The day when the simple woman they laughed at would walk through the same doors wearing a black robe and carrying a gavel instead of papers. The day humility would rise higher than arrogance, and justice would finally have a face they'd all recognize. The days moved slowly after that humiliating morning, but for Clara Reed, each passing sunrise felt like a quiet challenge. She woke up early every day, brewed her coffee in her tiny kitchen, and sat by the window with her law book stacked high beside her. Outside, the city roared, cars honking, people rushing to work. But inside her small apartment, the only sound was the steady turning of pages. She had made herself a silent promise, whispered through clenched determination. "They laughed once, but they will remember my name with respect." Her room had become her world. Piles of notes, sticky reminders, and a worn-out notebook filled with dreams she once thought were lost. Every night she studied for hours, her pen tapping lightly as she memorized court rules, procedures, and ethics. There were moments when her eyes ached from exhaustion, yet she refused to stop in that quiet space. Humiliation had transformed into hunger. The woman they mocked was rebuilding herself piece by piece, not for revenge, but for redemption. One afternoon, as she sat reading by the window, a soft knock came on her door. It was her neighbor, Mr. Ellis, an old retired police officer who often checked in on her. "You're always studying," he said kindly, handing her a bag of groceries. "What are you working so hard for?" Clara smiled gently. "Justice," she said simply. The old man chuckled, thinking it was a joke. "Justice, huh? That's a tough thing to chase these days." She looked down at her open notebook, her eyes firm. "Then I'll catch it myself," she said quietly. Later that week, Clara returned to the courthouse again, not for her case this time, but as an observer she wanted to understand everything. How judges spoke, how lawyers argued, how justice truly unfolded when no one expected to be watched. The same clerk from before noticed her walking in, this time with confidence instead of nervousness. "Back again?" he asked, half curious. Half mocking, Clara smiled politely. "Yes," she said. "Observation teaches more than pride." The man blinked. Unsure how to respond, she walked past him and took a seat in the back row. The same courtroom that once made her feel small now felt like a classroom. The lawyers argued loudly, the judge banged his gavel, and the public whispered, but Clara wasn't intimidated anymore. She was studying them all, the words, the tone, the timing, the law itself. During a break, she overheard two lawyers chatting near the door. One said, "Did you hear about the new judicial appointee coming next month? Supposedly some woman, they say she's young and smart." The other laughed. Hope she can handle pressure better than that woman who made a fool of herself last week. Clara felt their words like cold wind. But instead of anger, she smiled. Good, she thought. Let them talk. I'll give them a new story soon. As the day ended, she walked up the courthouse steps once more, the same ones she had left in shame weeks earlier. But this time her head was high. Her eyes scanned the grand building not with fear, but with familiarity. Soon, she whispered. These halls will greet me differently. That night, she received an email notification. It was from the National Judicial Board. Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked it open. The subject line read, Official Appointment Confirmation, Judge Clara Reed, District Court Division. For a long moment, she just stared at the words. Unable to breathe, her throat tightened. Tears welled in her eyes. She pressed a hand to her chest and whispered, Thank you, God. We did it, then she wiped her tears quickly, her face breaking into a small, proud smile. But Clara didn't announce her success to anyone. She didn't post it online, didn't tell her neighbors, didn't even mention it to her old colleagues. She wanted her return to speak for itself. She wanted silence to be her announcement. A week later, the courthouse buzzed again with gossip. The same clerks who once whispered about her humiliation now whispered about the new judge's arrival. I heard she's from the capital, one said. No. They said she's someone who's seen injustice up close, another replied. They speculated endlessly, but no one guessed the truth. Clara, meanwhile, stood in front of her mirror that morning, buttoning her freshly pressed black robe for the first time. It felt heavy, not because of fabric, but because of meaning. It carried everything she had endured, every laugh, every insult, every sleepless night. She looked at herself one last time and whispered softly, You don't need to shout to be powerful. Then she smiled, took her notebook from the desk, the same one that had held her tears and determination, and walked out the door. As she stepped into her car, her driver, assigned by the board, opened the door and greeted her formally. Good morning. Judge Reed. For a moment Clara froze, the words settling deep inside her. Judge Reed, she repeated quietly. Letting it sink in, she smiled faintly. Good morning indeed. The courthouse stood waiting in the distance. The same walls that had once watched her humiliation, now waiting to witness her triumph. The same guards who hadn't noticed her before would soon rise when she entered. The same lawyer who laughed at her would soon stand before her bench, not as her equal, but as the one pleading for respect. And as her car rolled toward the courthouse gates, Clara looked up at the clear blue sky and whispered, Justice doesn't need revenge. It just needs patience. What no one knew was that the woman they had dismissed as a nervous visitor had already become the very voice that would decide their fates. Her story was no longer about shame, and it was about resurrection, about how grace can turn wounds into wisdom, and how the quietest person in the room can end up commanding the loudest silence. The morning of Clara Reed's return to the courthouse was bright but heavy with anticipation. The air outside shimmered with light. Yet inside the courtroom, whispers floated like nervous birds. The clerks had polished every bench, the lawyers had straightened their ties, and even the guards stood taller than usual. Everyone was talking about the newly appointed judge who would be arriving today. None of them knew her name, but everyone expected someone important, someone powerful, someone unlike them. When the black car stopped in front of the courthouse, no one paid attention at first. A woman stepped out quietly, dressed in a neatly pressed robe and carrying a small black folder. Her stride was calm, not hurried. Her eyes scanned the building as if she had known it for years. The guards at the door moved to open it for her, and one of them froze mid-step. Recognizing her, "Wait, isn't that?" he whispered, but she walked past before he could finish. Inside, the clerk from before was arranging files when he looked up and saw her. His mouth fell open. "It can't be," he muttered. She gave him a gentle nod. "Good morning," she said softly. Her tone wasn't angry, not proud, just composed, as if she had already forgiven what the world hadn't realized it had done. The courtroom filled slowly, lawyers chatting, clients waiting. When the announcement came, "All rise for Judge Clara Reed," the sound hit the room like thunder. Every head turned, silence fell instantly. The laughter that once echoed through those same walls vanished in an instant. The same lawyer, Mr. Parker, who had mocked her, froze mid-step. His papers slipped from his hand. He stared at her as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. "No, it's her," he whispered. But she didn't look at him, not yet. She walked calmly to the judge's bench, her black robe flowing gently behind her. She sat down, placed her folder on the desk, and said in a voice steady as steel, "You may be seated." The room obeyed immediately. No one dared to speak, even the air felt still. Clara's gaze swept across the courtroom. The same faces that once sneered now looked down in shame. The clerk sat stiffly, the guard stood silent, and Mr. Parker avoided her eyes completely. Clara opened the first file and began the day's hearing. Her voice carried warmth, professionalism, and calm authority. "Case number 1, she said. Reed versus Parker." The lawyer's heart dropped. It was the same case, the same one he had mocked her over. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Parker," she said softly. "I believe we've met before." He swallowed hard, his voice cracking. Yes, Your Honor." She nodded gently. "Then you must remember how this case began." He nodded nervously. I do, Your Honor." She leaned slightly forward, her tone kind but cutting. "You interrupted a woman who was representing herself. You mocked her for not knowing procedure. You called her unqualified to stand here. Do you remember that too?" He looked down ashamed. "Yes." "Your Honor," he whispered. Clara nodded again. "Good," she said quietly. "Then perhaps you'll remember this moment better." The courtroom was silent. Utterly still, everyone's eyes were on her. Her words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of truth. She continued, "You see, Mr. Parker, the court is not a stage for pride, it is a place for respect. The person who stands before you, whether rich or poor, educated or not, deserves dignity. That is the law beyond all laws." Even the clerk seemed frozen. The same ones who once rolled their eyes now watched her with awe. Clara went through the case file again, her movements smooth, professional. She read every line with precision, not once raising her voice, not once showing anger. Instead, she carried herself with grace. The contrast was breathtaking. The same woman who had once been dismissed as weak now commanded absolute silence with a single word. At one point, a young lawyer sitting in the back whispered to his colleague, "I've never seen a courtroom so quiet." His friend nodded. "That's not quiet," he said, "that's respect." After finalizing the hearing, Clara closed the file gently and looked around the room. "The case is adjourned," she said calmly, "but let the memory of this day remain, for justice must never forget humility." As she stood, the people in the courtroom rose automatically, not just out of protocol, but out of admiration. The same crowd that once watched her humiliation now watched her rise, not with anger, but with grace that humbled them all. Mr. Parker stood trembling. "Your Honor," he said softly, I owe you an apology." Clara looked at him for the first time, her expression soft. "You owe it to yourself," she said, "because the measure of a man is not how loudly he speaks, but how deeply he listens." Then she turned, stepped down from the bench and walked out, her robe flowing gently, the sound of her footsteps echoing down the marble hall. Outside, the sun was brighter. The same steps where she once stood in shame now carried her stride with confidence. The reporters waiting outside looked puzzled. They hadn't expected the new judge to be the woman from that viral case. Cameras flashed, but Clara didn't stop. She simply smiled and said, no comment because her life no longer needed words. The court had spoken, justice had spoken, and humility had won in silence. As she walked away, one of the clerks whispered softly, "That woman just changed what it means to be a judge." And he was right. For that day, the courthouse didn't just witness the rise of a new judge. It witnessed the rebirth of respect. The same respect that had been lost when laughter filled the halls, now restored by the quiet strength of the woman they once humiliated. And for the first time in years, the courtroom truly felt like a place of justice again. The next morning, the courthouse felt different. It was the same grand building of marble floors and echoing halls, but the energy had shifted. People whispered differently now, not with gossip but with awe. The woman they had once mocked had become a symbol of something far greater, the return of dignity to justice. Judge Clara Reed arrived quietly again. No escort, no fuss. Her black robe flowed behind her as she carried her small notebook, the same one she had once held nervously as a visitor. Now it was filled with notes, principles, and reminders to stay humble no matter how high she rose. As she stepped inside, even the guard straightened instantly. "Good morning, Judge Reed," they said with respect that came from sincerity, not duty. She smiled gently. "Good morning, and please, Remember, respect is a two-way path. The guards nodded, surprised by her warmth when she entered the courtroom. The same people who had laughed before now fell silent at the mere sound of her heels. Lawyers stood immediately, and even the clerk avoided meeting her eyes for too long. It wasn't fear anymore, it was reverence. That day's hearings began with a tense case involving a poor woman being sued by a wealthy businessman over rent. The courtroom buzzed quietly. It was almost a mirror of the day Clara herself had been humiliated. The woman stood trembling in front of the bench. Her hands shaking, the businessman's lawyer smirked arrogantly. "Your Honor, this case is simple. My client owns the property, and this woman has no legal knowledge to defend herself." Clara looked at him calmly, her voice soft but firm. "Every voice in this courtroom deserves to be heard, counsel. Sit down." The man blinked in surprise and sat reluctantly. Then she turned to the woman. "Take your time," she said kindly. "Explain in your own words what happened." The woman hesitated, then began to speak softly about how her husband had died, how she had tried to pay but lost her job. The court listened in silence. Clara's eyes never left her. When the woman finished, Clara said, "Thank you for your honesty." She opened a folder and said, "I have reviewed your file, and it seems your payment records were misfiled due to a clerical error." "You are not at fault," gasps spread across the courtroom. The businessman's lawyer stood. "Your Honor?" "That's impossible." Clara raised a hand gently. "Do not interrupt again, counsel," she said. "Justice is not impossible, it is simply inconvenient for those who profit from silence." The man froze, and the audience stirred quietly. Some smiled faintly, understanding the message beneath her words. Clara continued, "This case is dismissed. The court will not allow arrogance to disguise itself as law." The poor woman broke into tears, covering her face. "Thank you, Your Honor," she whispered. Clara nodded gently. "You owe me nothing, ma'am. You owe yourself courage." When the hearing ended, people began clapping softly, something that never happened in a courtroom. The clerk looked nervous, unsure if he should stop them, but Clara smiled faintly and let it happen. After the session, as she returned to her chambers, she found a bouquet of white lilies on her desk with a note. "You reminded us what justice feels like." She read it quietly, then placed the flowers beside her law books. The same books she had once read under a dim lamp now sat in her office under sunlight. Later that day, she called for a private meeting with all the courthouse staff. They gathered nervously. Standing in a semicircle around her, Clara spoke calmly. "I don't want this court to be known for its power," she said. "I want it to be known for its compassion. The law is not a sword to cut down the weak. It is a shield to protect them." One of the younger clerks raised his hand timidly. "Ma'am, does that mean we treat everyone the same, even if they're rude or uneducated?" Clara smiled. "Especially then," she said softly, "because that's when they need understanding the most." Her words sank deep into everyone's heart. It wasn't just a lecture, and it was a reminder. The people standing before her suddenly realized that justice wasn't about memorizing laws. It was about carrying humanity with every decision. When evening came, Clara stayed behind in her office alone. She looked out the large window at the fading sunset over the city. The orange light painted the courthouse walls gold. Her reflection in the glass was calm, no longer the frightened woman from before, but a leader shaped by humiliation, empathy, and perseverance. She opened her small notebook and wrote one line at the bottom of a blank page. "Power means nothing if it forgets where it came from." Then she closed it gently and exhaled. The sound of laughter from the street below floated faintly through the open window. It reminded her of the people who had once laughed at her, but now instead of pain she felt peace. The same walls that had witnessed her embarrassment now echoed her authority. The same people who had mocked her name now spoke it with admiration. But Clara never let it reach her head, because she knew too well how fragile respect becomes when pride replaces purpose. And as the courthouse lights dimmed one by one, she whispered softly into the quiet room, "Justice doesn't rise from pride, it rises from pain." Healed and transformed, that night, the courthouse stood tall under the moonlight, proud yet humble, because within its walls sat a woman who had proven that humility isn't weakness. It's the quiet foundation of true power. The following week brought a strange calm to the courthouse. The air felt lighter, the staff moved faster, and even the lawyers who once strutted with arrogance now spoke more softly. People no longer feared Judge Clara Reed. They respected her deeply. Her name had spread through the legal community like wildfire. The humble woman who changed justice itself. Every day Clara arrived quietly, never late, never loud. She greeted the janitors, thanked the clerks, and listened to everyone, from the security guard to the senior prosecutor. Her presence carried warmth and discipline at the same time. It wasn't authority that demanded silence. It was grace that commanded it, but inside, Clara never forgot how she began. A nervous woman clutching a folder. Mocked and dismissed, she carried that memory not as bitterness but as a reminder. Each morning, before taking her seat at the bench, she would touch her robe gently and whisper to herself, "Remember who you were, so you don't become who they were." One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled outside, Clara's courtroom filled again. The case today was about a young law intern accused of mishandling evidence. The poor boy trembled as he stood before her. Barely able to speak, the opposing lawyer was ruthless, throwing sharp words like daggers. "This intern's negligence could have destroyed a case, Your Honor," he said. "He has no place in this court." Clara watched silently for a moment, her eyes calm. "What is your name?" she asked softly. "Ethan, Your Honor," he whispered. "I didn't mean to. I was told to file the papers quickly and The lawyer interrupted harshly. "Excuses, Your Honor. This is what happens when we let untrained people touch the law," the courtroom murmured, some agreeing, others frowning. Clara tapped her pen lightly, her tone still even. "Enough, counsel," she said. "I'll decide what happens here." "Not your arrogance." The lawyer froze and lowered his head. Clara leaned forward slightly, her gaze focused on the young intern. "Ethan," she said gently, "did anyone teach you how to file evidence correctly?" He shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am," Clara nodded. "Then your mistake belongs to those who failed to guide you. Not to you alone." The court fell silent. Every lawyer in the room knew what she was saying was true. Her voice carried experience. She knew what it was like to be blamed for not knowing, to be mocked for learning. Slowly, she continued, "I see a courtroom that demands perfection but forgets compassion. We correct through teaching, not through humiliation." She turned to the senior lawyer and added, "If the law had punished me the first time I misstepped, I wouldn't be sitting here. And you wouldn't be learning this lesson today." The man swallowed hard and lowered his gaze. "My apologies, Your Honor," he said quietly. Clara smiled faintly. "Apology accepted. But remember, humility is not a weakness. It's proof of strength." She turned to Ethan. "You're dismissed from blame, but not from growth. I expect you to learn, not hide." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "I will, Your Honor, I promise." When the hearing ended, a light applause rippled softly through the courtroom. Clara didn't stop at this time. She simply said, "Respect is contagious. I hope it spreads faster than judgment." Later that evening, Clara sat in her office, staring at the rain against the window. Each drop reminded her of the day she had stood on those same courthouse steps, humiliated and alone. She remembered the laughter, the whispers, the way the world had looked at her as if she didn't belong. Now she was shaping a world where everyone could belong. The clerk knocked softly and entered. "Your Honor, the press wants a comment for tomorrow's article. They're calling you the people's judge." Clara chuckled quietly. "The people's judge?" she repeated. "I'm just a woman who remembered what pain feels like." The clerk smiled. "Still, you've changed how everyone works here, ma'am. Even the arrogant lawyers are kinder." Clara nodded thoughtfully. "Then maybe we're finally learning the right kind of law." After he left, she opened her old brown notebook, its pages now filled with scribbles of wisdom gathered from experience. On a fresh page, she wrote a single line: "Justice grows where empathy is planted." She closed the notebook and leaned back, listening to the rain fade into silence. The courthouse lights dimmed one by one, leaving only her office glowing softly in the dark. She looked at her reflection in the glass, not the nervous woman who once stood trembling before a judge, but a woman who became one, forged by humiliation, polished by compassion. That night, as the storm cleared, Clara whispered softly into the quiet air, "May no one ever feel as small as I once did in this place." Because her greatest victory wasn't the robe she wore or the respect she earned. It was that she turned her own pain into protection for others. And somewhere deep in her heart, she knew that this was what justice was always meant to be. The sun rose gently over the city, painting the courthouse in shades of gold and white. It was the end of Clara Reed's first month as judge, yet it felt like the beginning of something far greater. The courthouse had changed, not in bricks or paint, but in spirit. The echo of arrogance that once filled its halls had been replaced with calm respect. People now entered the courtroom not with fear, but with faith. That morning, Clara walked through the marble corridor holding her small brown notebook as always. She paused to greet the janitor sweeping the floor. "Good morning, Mr. Harris," she said with a warm smile. He straightened quickly, embarrassed. "Good morning, Your Honor," he replied. Clara shook her head gently. "It's just Clara when I'm not on the bench." The man smiled faintly. "You're different from the others," he said. She chuckled softly. "No, I just remember what it feels like to be ignored." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was bright. People whispered stories of her fairness, how she helped a struggling mother, how she defended a student who couldn't afford representation. Even those who had once laughed at her name now spoke it with quiet admiration. As the first hearing began, Clara glanced at the front row and froze for a brief moment. Sitting there nervously was a familiar face, Mr. Parker, the same lawyer who had humiliated her months ago. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by visible shame. He held his briefcase tightly, avoiding her gaze when his case was called. He stood and approached the bench slowly. "Your Honor," he said softly, "before we begin, I want to say something." The courtroom went silent. Clara looked at him steadily. "Proceed," she said. He took a deep breath. "I was wrong," he said, "the day you came here. I treated you without respect. I mocked you. I laughed. I forgot that dignity belongs to everyone. No matter how they look, I just wanted to say..." He paused, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry." The silence in the courtroom was deep. Clara studied his face for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said quietly, "Mr. Parker, when you humiliated me, you didn't just hurt me. You hurt what this place stands for, but today, you reminded us what humility looks like." He blinked in surprise. "You're not angry?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "No, I'm grateful. Because if you hadn't mocked me that day, I might never have remembered how it feels to be voiceless. And I might not be the judge I am today." The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words settling like sunlight after a storm. Parker lowered his head. "You've taught me more about justice than any law book ever could," he said quietly. Clara nodded. "Then perhaps we both learned something. The law teaches rules, but life teaches empathy. And the second one is harder to master." The case proceeded, but the atmosphere had changed. There was no ego, no shouting, only quiet respect. Every lawyer in the room watched her differently now, not as an authority figure, but as a moral compass. When the session ended, Clara stood and said something she had never said before. "Before you leave, I want each of you to remember this. Justice isn't about winning. It's about listening. The law is powerful, but compassion makes it human." The people rose not just because it was tradition, but because they felt something deep. The kind of reverence that can't be demanded, only earned later that day. As the crowd cleared and the courthouse grew quiet again, Clara stood alone by the tall window, watching the sunlight fall across the empty benches. She could still hear faint laughter in her memory, the laughter from that humiliating day, but now it sounded distant, powerless. A knock came at the door. It was the young intern, Ethan, the one she had once defended. He stepped in shyly. "Your Honor, I just wanted to thank you. I passed my certification exam." Clara's eyes softened. "That's wonderful, Ethan. I'm proud of you." He smiled. "I couldn't have done it without your words. You showed me that mistakes don't define us." Clara nodded. "They refine us," she said gently when he left. She sat down at her desk and opened her brown notebook again. The pages were filled with quotes, lessons, and quiet reflections on a fresh page. She wrote, "Justice without empathy is a verdict without meaning." She leaned back, looking out at the skyline, the world below moving in its usual rhythm. But for her, time felt still, calm, fulfilled. As the evening light bathed the courthouse in orange and gold, Clara whispered softly to herself, "They once laughed at me here. Now they listen." And in that moment she realized her journey wasn't about revenge or reputation. It was about restoration. She hadn't come back to prove she was powerful. She came back to remind the world that the quietest souls often carry the strongest truth.